In a cold, candlelit chamber, bound in iron shackles, a woman screamed, not out of confession, but from unbearable pain. And in that moment, the court declared her guilty. Her crime? Witchcraft. Her proof? Her own voice, shrieking in agony as her body was crushed, pierced, and burned. Welcome to the witch trials of Würzburg, one of the most horrifying yet lesser-known chapters in Europe's history of mass hysteria. Between 1626 and 1631, over 900 people were executed in a single city. Teachers, children, nuns, priests, entire families, all accused of making pacts with the devil. Their trials were spectacles of torment, where the screams of the innocent were twisted into evidence. This wasn't just about witches. This was about fear weaponized, faith distorted, and power run mad. The chilling part? It all unfolded inside a Christian stronghold, under a bishop who saw himself as God's judge, jury, and executioner. What began as paranoia soon became a machine of terror, and every scream pushed the blade deeper. This is not the Salem story you know. This is the story of Würzburg, where silence meant innocence, and screaming sealed your fate. Now, let's go back to where the nightmare began. It began with a storm. In the late summer of 1626, lightning struck the spire of Würzburg's Marienkapelle, shattering its sacred cross and setting fire to part of the roof. Locals whispered that it was an omen, a warning from God. But within the bishop's palace, the interpretation was far darker. Prince Bishop Philip Adolf von Ehrenberg was no ordinary man of the cloth. He was a nobleman, a political leader, and above all, a religious zealot in the grip of apocalyptic fear. To him, the lightning bolt was not a natural event. It was a sign that the devil had infiltrated Würzburg, and the only way to purify the city was fire. Philip Adolf had inherited a region already teetering on the edge. The 30 Years' War was raging across Europe, pitting Protestant and Catholic forces against one another in a catastrophic spiral of bloodshed and famine. Plague stalked the countryside. Crops failed. Children starved. And in the absence of answers, people turned to superstition. The bishop saw his mission clearly, to root out witchcraft at all costs. And like many before him, he believed witches were not mere heretics. They were soldiers of Satan, living among the righteous. Deceivers, saboteurs, enemies of God disguised as neighbors. But what set Philip Adolf apart was his method. Rather than allow fear to die down, he fed it. He established commissions, panels of judges, clerics, and inquisitors, whose sole task was to seek out witches in every parish, village, and household. They weren't looking for suspects. They were building a quota. The process was efficient, ruthless, industrial. By the winter of 1627, the city of Würzburg had become a furnace of accusation. The bishop constructed a special prison just for alleged witches, a grim fortress with no windows, no sunlight, and no hope. Torture was not a last resort. It was the starting point. Anyone could be accused. A merchant's wife who dreamed of snakes. A scholar who questioned a miracle. A boy who played in the woods and claimed to see things. Each arrest fed the machine, and each execution served as both punishment and propaganda. The bishop preached from his pulpit. Satan is clever. He hides in plain sight. You must watch your neighbor. Watch your own children. Watch yourself. The city watched, and it turned on itself. A schoolteacher was accused by a rival. Burned. A baker's apprentice stumbled during communion. Burned. A nun heard voices during prayer. Burned. Even priests were not safe. In one infamous case, a cathedral canon named Johannes Junius was imprisoned for months, tortured relentlessly, and finally forced to confess to dancing with the devil at a black mass. He left behind a secret letter to his daughter, smuggled out of prison with trembling hands, where he wrote, "Innocent the First came into prison. Innocent the First was tortured. Innocent the First must die." The bishop never read the letter. He didn't need to. He had the confession. This was not justice. It was arithmetic. More accusations led to more arrests. More screams led to more confessions. And each execution was proof the bishop was winning the war against hell. But he wasn't fighting demons. He was creating them. By early 1628, entire families had vanished. The streets of Würzburg were quieter now, not because peace had returned, but because fear had silenced everything. Even the churches smelled of ash. The bishop stood atop his castle walls and looked out over his city of smoke. To him, this was purification, a holy war, a necessary sacrifice. But below, in the charred ruins of homes and the cold cells of the accused, something else was rising. A deeper madness, a logic of pain so twisted, it would soon turn its gaze toward the most innocent among them, the children. They came for the children in the dead of night. No warning, no mercy. It began with whispers, mothers talking too loudly in the marketplace, neighbors watching from behind cracked shutters. The idea that children could be witches wasn't new. But in Würzburg, it became a doctrine, a truth so unshakable it needed no proof. Because, after all, who better to carry out the devil's work than those who were purest? The unspoiled, the unseen. It sounds insane because it was. Yet between 1627 and 1629, dozens of children, some as young as 7, were arrested, tortured, and executed in the name of spiritual cleansing. There are court records, testimonies, even execution logs, chilling in their matter-of-fact tone. Like the entry dated July 3, 1628. Executed, Margaretha Horn, aged 9. Confessed to causing frost and hail upon vineyards. Burned at the stake. How does a child confess to calling storms? The answer is simple and horrifying. They were taught to. Once inside the bishop's dungeons, the children were subjected to the same tools of examination as adults. The strappado, where they were hoisted by the arms and dropped until joints dislocated. The thumbscrew, the iron vise, burning tongs, deprivation, isolation, sleep denied for days. At first, they screamed. Then, they broke. Then, they started naming names. And that's what the court wanted. Under torture, children confessed to flying through the night with horned beasts, to eating babies in the woods, to sneaking into churches and spitting on the Eucharist. They named siblings, teachers, priests, parents, because they thought it would stop the pain. But it only fed it. The more names they gave, the more arrests followed. The bishop's inquisitors called it a divine revelation. They said the devil had infected the bloodline of entire families, and children were his spies. The younger the accused, the more terrifying the implication. Satan was starting earlier. Some parents tried to fight back, pleaded before the bishop, but the more they protested, the more suspicious they became. Grief became evidence. Mourning was twisted into guilt. One woman, Katharina Merklerin, was hanged after she wept at her daughter's execution. The court claimed her sorrow was proof she'd raised a witch. Her final words? If a mother's love is sin, then may God damn you all. But there were other victims, those who survived. One boy, only known as Hans, was 11 when he was taken. He endured 2 weeks of beatings, cold confinement, and starvation before he confessed to seeing a goat with human eyes. He named for classmates. All of them were executed. Hans was released, but he never spoke again. He wandered the city in silence for months before vanishing entirely. Some say he jumped into the river. Others believe the church took him back in secret to ensure his silence remained permanent. This was more than cruelty. It was systemic annihilation, an assault on innocence itself. And as the flames consumed more and more of Würzburg's children, a terrifying thought began to grow in the minds of its people. If children could be witches, then no one was safe. Every breath became suspect. Every look, every word, every twitch of the eye. But still, the bishop wasn't satisfied. He wanted something more public, more theatrical. He wanted pain, performed. And so, he transformed the courtroom itself into a theater of screams, where torment would be seen, heard, believed. Imagine this. You're brought into a stone chamber beneath the bishop's palace. It smells of mold, blood, and old fire. The walls are damp. The floor is slick. Chains hang from the ceiling like butcher's hooks. There is no judge in a robe, no jury, no defense. Only a panel of inquisitors with sharpened tools, open books, and hollow eyes. This was the courtroom in Würzburg, where the scream was the sentence. From 1627 onward, the city's trials no longer resembled legal proceedings. They were rituals, sacred and brutal, where guilt was preordained, and the only question was how long it would take to extract a confession. In most cases, not long. Torture in Würzburg was codified by the Carolina, the Holy Roman Empire's criminal code. But Bishop Philip Adolf cared little for its limitations. He believed pain was a gift, the flame that revealed the truth. And under his reign, the process was terrifyingly organized. First came the accusation, often anonymous, always accepted. Second, the examination. The accused were stripped, shaved, and searched for the devil's mark, a mole, scar, or blemish that didn't bleed when pricked. If found, it was proof of a pact with Satan. Then came the instruments. The strappado was a favorite. Victims had their arms tied behind their back and were hoisted by a rope attached to the ceiling. Then, suddenly, they were dropped. Shoulders dislocated. Sockets tore. Tendons snapped. The rack came next, stretching the body until bones separated. Then the boots. Iron casings filled with wedges, hammered tighter and tighter until legs splintered. One woman, Maria Renata, was subjected to the thumbscrews for 4 hours before finally crying out. Not in confession, but in agony. That was enough. Her scream was recorded as an admission of guilt. She was hanged 3 days later. The logic was flawless in its madness. If you didn't scream, you were a witch, because witches felt no pain. If you did scream, you were also a witch, because your confession proved it. And if you died during torture, that, too, was confirmation. Only the guilty died in torment. Some victims never made it to the fire. In the depths of the torture chambers, many simply bled out, collapsed from shock, or were strangled by the devices meant to make them speak. Their bodies were buried in unmarked pits, their names erased from church records. Others, like Johannes Junius, were forced to sign confessions written for them. His final statement, smuggled out in blood-stained parchment, revealed the truth of the process. I have never seen the devil. I have never renounced God. I have only said what they wished so that the pain would stop. Still, his scream, echoing through the hall, was all the court needed. But the horror didn't stop in the chamber. These confessions were then read aloud during public sermons, announced in the town square, and etched into city records. The people were told, "This is justice. This is God's work." The church printed pamphlets detailing the confessions, spreading fear like wildfire. Some included woodcut illustrations of witches dancing in hellish forests. Others listed names, dates, and methods of execution. The bishop believed transparency was divine. The more people saw, the more they would fear. The more they feared, the more obedient they became. It worked. Public executions became ritualized spectacles. Thousands gathered to watch flames consume the condemned. Bells rang. Priests prayed. Children wept. And above them all, from the bishop's balcony, Philip Adolf watched silently. His face unreadable. His conscience long dead. The court had become a furnace. Not just of flesh, but of reason, of hope, of humanity. And yet, there were still those who clung to truth. Inside monasteries, behind locked doors, in secret diaries and whispered prayers, some began to write, to document, to resist. But doing so came at a price, because to question the trials was to invite the flames. It is perhaps the most disturbing truth of all. The killing was not seen as murder. It was seen as mercy. Inside the ornate halls of the Würzburg Cathedral, beneath the soaring arches and golden crosses, sermons were delivered that would send innocent people to the stake. Priests stood at the pulpit, eyes fixed on the crowd, and proclaimed that God demanded purification, that the devil walked among them, that to spare a witch was to invite damnation. And the people believed it, because the bishop had made sure they would. Philip Adolf von Ehrenberg wasn't just the city's ruler, he was its spiritual shepherd. And like the inquisitors of earlier centuries, he fused religious authority with absolute power. The result was a new kind of theology, one soaked in blood. He called it sacrificium ad lucem, a sacrifice to the light. In his view, the fires of execution were not punishments, but divine offerings. The souls of the condemned were cleansed by the flames, their bodies destroyed to save the city's soul. This wasn't just doctrine, it was destiny. And any voice raised against it was heresy. When a Jesuit scholar dared question the trials, suggesting that innocent people might be dying, he was branded soft on Satan. Days later, he disappeared. His writings were seized and burned. His name was never spoken again. In this warped vision of faith, suffering became sacred. Martyrdom wasn't chosen, it was imposed. And even the Bible was weaponized. Passages from Exodus and Leviticus were read aloud in court. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. These words, lifted from ancient scripture, were treated as present-day mandates. Context didn't matter. Translation didn't matter. All that mattered was obedience. Priests blessed the executioners. Monks accompanied victims to the pyre, urging them to repent and be cleansed. Choirs sang hymns as smoke curled into the sky. In one particularly grotesque execution, a 12-year-old boy was burned while a preacher declared, "The Lord mocketh no distinction between age and evil." The crowd nodded. Some wept. No one intervened. Because to question was to sin. But not all believers were blind. In secret, some scribes began recording what they saw, not as propaganda, but as witness. These hidden writings, smuggled out by terrified monks, tell a very different story from the bishop's sermons. They speak of screams echoing through cloisters, of priests collapsing in tears after blessing a child's execution, of confessions forged in agony, then sanctified with holy water. One monk wrote, "I fear we have confused the devil's voice with God's, and now we burn our brothers and sisters as offerings to a lie." He would later vanish, but his words survived. Meanwhile, Philip Adolf doubled down. In 1629, he ordered a cleansing of the monasteries, accusing nuns of harboring demons and priests of secret heresy. Several were executed. Others disappeared into underground prisons, never to be seen again. Würzburg had become a theological prison, a city where faith was no longer a comfort, but a weapon. And still, the bishop claimed righteousness. In a letter to a fellow prince bishop, he wrote, "Better to burn 10 innocent than spare one witch. For the devil is subtle and the soul eternal." Those words would be engraved into the marble walls of his private chapel. But history would carve something darker into his legacy. Because the tide was beginning to turn. Outside Würzburg, whispers of horror spread. Envoys, travelers, even clergy began questioning what they were hearing. Other regions started pulling back from their own witch trials. Skepticism grew, and with it, scrutiny. The fires were burning too brightly, and soon, they'd draw the wrong kind of attention. But the bishop didn't see it coming. He was too busy chasing shadows, too busy purging what he believed to be evil, even when that evil stared back at him from the mirror. The dead do not speak. But in Würzburg, some made sure their voices would never be silenced. Hidden beneath floorboards, behind monastery walls, and folded into the seams of garments, confessions, real ones, were preserved. Not the ones extracted through agony, but those written in secret, in truth, in desperation. They are the only witnesses we have left. One of the most famous came from Johannes Junius, the former mayor of Würzburg and one of the most respected men in the city. Arrested in 1628, he was dragged before the inquisitors and charged with consorting with demons and attending witches' sabbaths. He denied everything, so they broke him. For days, he endured the strappado, his arms torn from their sockets, his legs crushed in iron boots, his nails pulled, his jaw shattered. He screamed, he bled, and then, finally, he confessed to anything they wanted. But in the shadow of his cell, he smuggled out a final letter to his daughter, Veronica. "Dearest child, I must tell you the truth. Your father is innocent. They forced me to name others, good people, who will now die. I beg you, forgive me. I could not endure the pain. I did not want to die in silence." The letter is written in trembling German script, inked with soot and blood. Today, it rests in a museum in Bamberg, a whisper from the ashes. He was burned 3 days after writing it. But Junius was not alone. Across Würzburg, victims began leaving behind messages, confessions not of guilt, but of betrayal. They wrote of names they were forced to give, of the lies they told to make the pain stop, of the horrors they saw others endure. Some scribbled prayers in the margins of Bibles. Others carved initials into dungeon walls with broken fingernails. A monk named Pater Anton kept a secret ledger, recording every trial he witnessed. He wrote of an 8-year-old boy who screamed for his mother until his lungs collapsed, of a pregnant woman forced to confess, only to lose her child in the cell before being taken to the pyre. Anton's final entry reads, "The devil is not among the people. He wears the robes of the bishop. He vanished the next week." These fragments form a grim mosaic, a truth far darker than the official records ever admitted. Because the bishop's regime was meticulous, he had scribes document every confession, every sentence, every death. But they were lies, stitched together under pain and fear. In his archives, you'll find statements like, "I flew to the Brocken Mountain on a goat. I danced with the devil and gave him my soul. I poisoned the well." The handwriting is shaky, the ink smudged. Sometimes, there are drops of blood on the parchment. They read like fantasy, because they are. But that didn't stop the machine. Each false confession fueled the next trial. Victims were forced to name others in long chains, like contagion. One accused begot 5 more, and each of them, under torture, would name 5 more still. Entire social networks collapsed. Friends turned on friends, children on parents, husbands on wives. It was not truth that governed Würzburg. It was momentum, a mass hysteria wrapped in the sacred cloth of faith. And still, Philip Adolf called it justice. But cracks were forming in his empire. In 1630, imperial authorities in the Holy Roman Empire began to investigate. Reports from fleeing clerics and surviving townspeople had reached Vienna and beyond. Even other prince-bishops began distancing themselves from Philip Adolf's methods. The tide of witch hunting was shifting away from fire toward reason. But in Würzburg, the flames still rose, because the bishop had gone too far to turn back. In his mind, the city's soul depended on total purification. He believed that until the last witch was burned, God would not bless Würzburg. And so he continued. The executions grew more frequent, the accused younger, the evidence thinner. By 1631, even members of the bishop's own court were being arrested. His advisors, his guards, his scribes. Power was cannibalizing itself. And then, the war came to his doorstep. Swedish Protestant armies, sweeping through the Holy Roman Empire, approached Würzburg. As they closed in, the people began to flee. The prisons were emptied. Fires doused. Documents burned. The bishop? He vanished. Some say he escaped in the night, dressed as a monk. Others claim he died of illness soon after. No grave was marked. No monument raised. Just silence. In the end, it wasn't truth that ended the witch trials of Würzburg. It was war. And when the smoke cleared, over 900 men, women, and children had perished. Their only crime, being alive in the wrong place, at the wrong time, under the wrong eyes. But even then, the ashes still carried their voices. And they were not done speaking. By the spring of 1631, Würzburg no longer resembled a city. It was a husk. The streets that once bustled with markets and music now echoed with footsteps of soldiers. The skies, once thick with black smoke, had cleared. The great cathedral loomed over empty squares, its bells silent. And the execution grounds, once soaked with blood, grew weeds. The witch trials were over. Not because justice prevailed, but because war had finally done what reason could not. When Swedish Protestant forces descended upon Würzburg during the 30 Years' War, they found a city already broken. Survivors wandered like ghosts, mute, hollow-eyed, traumatized. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned. Churches desecrated. Families gone. What the bishop had started as a crusade of faith had become a self-consuming nightmare. The warlords weren't interested in the witch trials. They cared only for territory, alliances, and spoils. But in their wake, they left an unexpected gift, silence. With the bishop vanished, likely dead, there was no one left to fan the flames. His records were seized. Torture chambers sealed. The machinery of accusation ground to a halt. And into that silence came questions. How had this happened? How had so many been burned, hanged, drowned, without a single witch ever being proven? The answers came slowly. In the years following the collapse of the trials, a handful of surviving clergy and scholars began piecing together what had truly occurred. They compared diaries, smuggled letters, eyewitness testimonies. They uncovered forged confessions, coerced names, and a pattern of mass paranoia that spread like a virus. But not everyone wanted truth. Some still believed the executions had been righteous, that the bishop had been a hero who saved Würzburg from Satan's grip. These defenders cited scripture, old sermons, and miracle claims. Others simply wanted to forget. The city, after all, had a reputation to rebuild, trade to restore, churches to fill. Dwelling on the horrors meant confronting collective guilt, and that was too heavy a burden. So the documents were buried. The victims' names erased from registers. Their homes seized and resold. Their stories lost or deliberately hidden. But not all of them. One woman, a former nun named Sister Magdalena, had witnessed the execution of over 100 people. She had tended to the sick in the dungeons, whispered prayers to children before they were dragged to the stake, and secretly copied down the true confessions of the accused. When the war ended, she fled to a convent in Bamberg and began compiling what she called the Black Book of Würzburg. In it, she wrote, "This was not a battle between God and the devil. It was between power and the powerless. And we, the faithful, were its weapon." Her book would remain hidden for over a century, only rediscovered in the 18th century during a church archive reorganization. It contained over 400 names, dozens of letters, and chilling sketches of the torture devices used. It was the first true historical record of the Würzburg trials. Even then, it was dismissed by many as exaggeration. Too horrible to be real. Too monstrous to be true. But it was true. In time, Würzburg rebuilt itself. The executions faded from public memory. The cathedral was restored. Markets reopened. Children played where gallows once stood. But the soil never forgot. To this day, human remains are occasionally unearthed during construction, bones scorched black, teeth shattered, wrists broken. Evidence of what was done beneath the banner of God. No official monument honors the victims. No national day of mourning exists. Just a few museum plaques, some archival papers, and stories whispered by historians. And yet, the legacy remains, like ash in the river. Because what happened in Würzburg was not an isolated incident. It was a mirror, a glimpse into how easily fear can wear the mask of faith, how justice can be twisted into vengeance, how screams can be silenced and still echo for centuries. The bishop believed he was purging evil, but in truth, he created it. And the souls burned in Würzburg did not go quietly. They left behind their stories, scratched into walls, hidden in letters, carried in smoke. If we choose to listen, they still speak. The story of the Würzburg witch trials is not just a historical footnote. It's a warning, a testament to the darkness that follows when power, religion, and fear form an unholy alliance. Over 900 lives were erased, not by magic or malevolence, but by silence, obedience, and belief without question. And perhaps that's the most terrifying part. Because if it happened once, it can happen again. The faces may change. The tools may modernize. But the core, the machinery of fear, remains. So what do we do with this knowledge? We remember. We honor the forgotten. Honor the names lost to fire. And if you want more hidden, haunting, and horrifying true stories from the past, subscribe to Mind-Blown History and hit that notification bell. Because history isn't dead. It's just waiting to be heard. Until next time, be careful who you trust with your soul.